Imagine a woman born into poverty, the fourth daughter of a poor family, who lost her parents while still young, who was caught up in a famine and sold into slavery, who labored hard under a master, and who rose from these humble and sorrowful beginnings to become one of the most revered saints in the history of her faith. Imagine a soul so devoted to God that, by the accounts, when she prayed at night, a light was seen to surround her, so that her master, beholding it, was filled with awe and set her free. Imagine a heart so given to the love of God that she wished neither for the rewards of paradise nor for escape from the fires of punishment, but only for God alone, loving God not for any reward or out of any fear, but purely for God's own sake. Imagine a woman who, freed from her slavery, gave the rest of her life to devotion, living simply in or near the city of Basra, spending her days and nights in prayer and the remembrance of God, refusing the offers of marriage that came to her, choosing instead a life given wholly to the love of the divine. Imagine a teacher whose sayings, preserved across the centuries, express a love of God so pure, so free of self-interest, so wholly given to the beloved, that they have been treasured for more than 1,200 years as among the most beautiful expressions of divine love ever spoken. Imagine a woman who became, in a tradition and an age in which women were rarely accorded such honor, one of the most revered figures of her faith's spiritual life, a saint whose holiness was acknowledged by the greatest scholars of her age, who is remembered as among the first and greatest of the mystics of her tradition, the one who, more than any other, set forth the doctrine of pure and selfless love of God. Imagine a life that rose from slavery to sainthood, from poverty to a spiritual greatness revered across the centuries. This is the story of such a woman. Her name was Rabia, and she is remembered as Rabia al-Adawiyya, or Rabia of Basra, after the city where she lived. She was born more than 1,300 years ago, in the 8th century, in the city of Basra, in what is now Iraq. She was, by the accounts, a freed slave who became one of the most revered saints of her faith, the first and among the greatest of its women mystics, who set forth, more than any other, the doctrine of the pure and selfless love of God, and whose sayings have been treasured for more than 1,200 years. We will follow her whole life tonight, slowly and gently, as much of it as can be known and as the beloved traditions relate it, from her birth into poverty to her slavery and her freeing, her life of devotion in Basra, her teaching of the pure love of God, and the close of her devoted life. We should say, at the outset, that much of what is told of her comes to us through traditions gathered long after her time, beautiful stories treasured by those who revered her, and that the historical facts of her life are few and uncertain. We will tell her story gently, as the tradition relates it, treasuring the beautiful accounts while acknowledging their uncertainty, for it is the Rabia of the tradition, the beloved saint of divine love, whose story has touched hearts across the centuries, and through it all runs a quiet question, gentle and enduring. What does it mean to love purely, without thought of reward or fear of punishment, to give one's heart wholly to what one loves, for its own sake alone? This was the heart of Rabia's life and teaching, the pure and selfless love of God, and it poses a question that reaches beyond any particular faith, to the nature of love itself, the purest love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the beloved. So settle in, and let your mind grow calm. There is no hurry here. We have a long and peaceful journey ahead, through a distant world and a single remarkable life. You do not need to remember every name or every detail. You only need to rest, and to listen, and to let this old and beautiful story carry you gently towards sleep. Wherever you are, however tired you feel, you are welcome here. Let the cares of the day grow quiet, and let us travel back together to a world that is more than 1,300 years old. Perhaps you have felt, in some quiet moment of your own, something of the longing that filled Rabia's life. the longing to love purely, to give one's heart wholly to something beyond oneself, to be free of the calculations of self-interest, the hopes of reward and the fears of loss, and simply to love. Most of us know something of this longing, the wish to love truly and purely, even if our love is so often tangled with self-interest, with what we hope to gain or fear to lose. Rabia loved with a purity that has rarely been matched, a love of God so free of self-interest that it sought no reward and feared no punishment, but only the beloved. There is a quiet beauty, as the night settles, in keeping company with such a pure and selfless love. So as we begin the long walk back through her life, carry no burden of effort. You are not being asked to study or to remember. You are being invited to rest, and to let an old and beautiful story unfold at its own unhurried pace, the way the night itself unfolds, slowly and gently, toward the quiet of deep sleep. We will move softly, and there is nothing you need to do but listen, and let the calm of it settle over you like a blanket drawn up in the dark. To understand the woman, we must first understand the world that made her, and the kind of spiritual life that she came to embody. We must travel back to the 8th century, to the city of Basra, in the early generations of her faith, in an age when the spiritual life of that faith was deepening and developing in new and profound ways. For Rabia lived in an important age in the development of her faith's spiritual tradition, and she became one of its central figures, helping to shape the spiritual life of her faith for centuries to come. Let us dwell a while on the city of Basra, where Rabia lived her whole life. For it was a remarkable place, and understanding it helps us to picture the world in which she moved. Basra was, in Rabia's age, one of the great cities of the early Islamic world, a center of commerce and learning, and the developing spiritual life of the faith. The city lay in the lands of what is now southern Iraq, near the head of the Persian Gulf, where the great rivers of the region approached the sea, in a land of waterways and marshes and date palms. It was a relatively new city, founded in the early years of the faith's expansion as a garrison town, which had grown rapidly into a great city, a center of trade and population in the fertile lands of the south. By Rabia's time, it was a large and prosperous city, bustling with commerce, populous and wealthy, one of the great urban centers of the early Islamic world. It was a city of considerable wealth and commerce, for it lay at an important point for trade, near the head of the Gulf, where the trade of the sea met the trade of the land and the rivers. Merchants and goods flowed through it, the commerce of the maritime trade and the river trade and the caravan routes, making it a prosperous and bustling commercial center. The wealth of this commerce filled the city, creating a prosperous and worldly urban society, bustling with trade and the pursuit of wealth, full of the energy and the temptations of a great commercial city. And it was a city of learning and culture, a center of the developing scholarship of the faith, home to many of the learned and the devout. As the city grew and prospered, it developed into an important center of learning, where the sciences of the faith were studied, where scholars gathered, where the intellectual and religious life of the faith flourished. It was known for its scholars and its schools, its learning and its piety, one of the great centers of the developing culture of the faith. The young faith's intellectual and spiritual life flourished in Basra, making it a center of learning and devotion, as well as commerce. In particular, as we have noted, Basra was an important center of the developing spiritual life of the faith, home to many of the early ascetics and devout, the figures who sought the deeper inward experience of the divine. The city, for all its commerce and worldliness, was also a center of intense piety and devotion, home to many who renounced the world's pursuits for the sake of God, who sought the deeper spiritual life amid the bustling commercial city. There was a striking contrast in Basra between its worldly commerce and its intense piety, between the pursuit of wealth that filled its markets and the renunciation of the world that filled its devout. And Rabia lived amid this contrast, a figure of intense devotion in a bustling commercial city, a renouncer of the world in a center of worldly commerce. We can imagine Rabia, then, in this great city, this bustling commercial center that was also a center of learning and devotion, this prosperous worldly city that was also home to intense piety. We can imagine her in or near the city, living her life of devotion amid its bustle and commerce, a figure of renunciation in a city of wealth, a soul devoted to the love of God in a center of worldly pursuit. The contrast between her devotion and the worldliness of her city makes her piety the more striking. The renouncer of the world living amid the pursuit of wealth, the lover of God dwelling in a center of commerce. A fitting quality marks, perhaps, the flourishing of such intense devotion amid the worldliness of a great commercial city. For the very worldliness of the city, its wealth and commerce and pursuit of gain, may have called forth, by contrast, the intense devotion of those who renounced it, the longing for God of those who saw the emptiness of worldly pursuit. Basra's prosperity and worldliness coexisted with intense piety and devotion, the renunciation of the world flourishing amid the pursuit of it, the love of God deepening amid the love of wealth. And Rabia was among the greatest of those who, amid the worldliness of Basra, gave themselves wholly to God, a figure of intense devotion in a center of worldly commerce, whose love of God shone the brighter against the worldliness of her city. So picture Rabia against the background of her city, this bustling commercial center that was also a center of learning and devotion, this prosperous worldly city that was also home to intense piety. It was a fitting setting for her life of devotion, this contrast between the worldliness of the city and the intensity of her love of God, between the pursuit of wealth that surrounded her and the renunciation that she embodied. The freed slave who gave her life to the pure love of God lived amid the commerce and bustle of a great worldly city, her devotion shining the brighter against its worldliness, her love of God the more striking amid the pursuit of wealth that surrounded her. The city of Basra, where she lived, was a great city of the early Islamic world, a center of commerce and learning in the lands of what is now southern Iraq, near the head of the Persian Gulf, where the great rivers approached the sea. It was a city of considerable wealth and sophistication, a center of trade and scholarship, home to many of the learned and the pious of the early generations of the faith. And it was, in particular, an important center of the developing spiritual life of the faith, home to many who devoted themselves to piety and devotion, to the deepening of the inner life, to the love and the remembrance of God. For in these early generations, the spiritual tradition of the faith was developing and deepening, as devout souls sought to deepen their devotion, to purify their hearts, to draw nearer to God. This developing tradition, which would later flower into the rich spiritual tradition of the faith, emphasized the inner life, the purification of the heart, the cultivation of devotion, the love and remembrance of God. And Basra was an important center of this developing tradition, home to many of its early figures, the devout and the pious who sought to deepen the spiritual life of the faith. Rabia would become one of the greatest of these figures, a central figure in the developing spiritual tradition, who set forth, more than any other, the doctrine of the pure love of God. Let us dwell a while longer on the spiritual world in which Rabia lived, the developing tradition of inner devotion that she helped to shape, for it is essential to understanding her significance, and it was a remarkable development in the history of her faith. For Rabia lived in the early generations of her faith's spiritual tradition, in the time when the inner, mystical dimension of the faith was deepening and developing in profound ways. In the early generations of the faith, as the first fervor of its founding gave way to the establishment of a great and prosperous civilization, some among the devout felt a longing for a deeper spiritual life, a closer relationship with God, a more inward and intense devotion than the mere outward observance of religious duties. They sought to deepen their devotion, to purify their hearts, to draw nearer to God through prayer and remembrance and the cultivation of the inner life. And from this longing grew the spiritual tradition that would later flower into the rich mystical tradition of the faith, the tradition of those who sought the deepest inward experience of the divine. This developing tradition emphasized the inner life over the merely outward, the state of the heart over the mere performance of religious duties. It cultivated devotion, the love and remembrance of God, the purification of the heart from worldly attachment, the deepening of the inner relationship with the divine. It sought not merely to fulfill the outward requirements of the faith, but to attain a deep inward experience of God, a closeness, a love, a union of the heart with the divine. This was the developing spiritual tradition of the early generations, the tradition of inner devotion that sought the deepest experience of God. In its earliest phase, this tradition was often marked by a strong emphasis on asceticism and the fear of God, on renunciation of the world and the sober awareness of judgment. Many of the early devout were ascetics, who renounced the world's comforts, who wept in fear of judgment, who cultivated a sober and serious devotion focused on the fear of God and the renunciation of the world. This early asceticism, this devotion marked by the fear of God and the renunciation of the world, was an important phase in the development of the spiritual tradition, the soil from which its later flowering would grow. And it was into this developing tradition, this world of early asceticism and devotion, that Rabia came, and she brought to it something new and profound: the emphasis on love. For while the early tradition often emphasized the fear of God and the renunciation of the world, Rabia emphasized the love of God, the pure and selfless love that sought nothing for itself, but only the beloved. She moved the tradition from the emphasis on fear toward the emphasis on love, from the sober devotion focused on judgment toward the warm devotion focused on the love of God. In this, she made a profound contribution to the development of the spiritual tradition, introducing or deepening the theme of divine love that would become central to its later flowering. This was Rabia's great contribution to the spiritual tradition of her faith, the emphasis on the pure and selfless love of God, which she set forth more clearly and embodied more fully than any before her. She is remembered as the one who, more than any other, brought the theme of divine love into the developing tradition, who shifted its emphasis from fear toward love, who set forth the doctrine of the pure love of God that would become central to the mysticism of her faith. The rich tradition of divine love that would later flower in the mysticism of her faith traced much of its origin to Rabia, who stood near its source, the first great teacher of the pure love of God. We can understand, then, the significance of Rabia in the history of her faith's spiritual tradition. She was not merely one devout figure among many, but a pivotal figure, who brought to the developing tradition the central theme of divine love, who shifted its emphasis from fear toward love, who set forth the doctrine of pure and selfless love that would become central to its later flowering. The freed slave from Basra became one of the founders of a great spiritual tradition, the first great teacher of the divine love that would become its central theme, a pivotal figure in the development of the mysticism of her faith. And there is something fitting in the fact that this teaching of divine love should have come, in large part, from a woman, from one who had known the depths of hardship and risen through devotion to spiritual greatness. For the love that Rabia taught was a love born not of comfortable circumstances, but of a heart that had known hardship, and found in the love of God its refuge and its fulfillment. Her teaching of divine love grew from her own experience, the experience of a soul that had known slavery and sorrow and found in the love of God a fulfillment beyond all the world could offer. And from this experience, this knowing of the love of God as the heart's true fulfillment, came her teaching of the pure love of God, her great contribution to the spiritual tradition of her faith. This, then, was the world into which Rabia came, and the tradition that she would help to shape. The city of Basra in the 8th century, an important center of the developing spiritual life of the faith, home to many of the devout and the pious. Into this world a child was born, in poverty, who would rise from slavery to become one of the most revered saints of her faith, a central figure in its developing spiritual tradition, who set forth the doctrine of the pure and selfless love of God. So let us leave the wider world behind now, and turn toward the city of Basra, where a child was born into poverty who would become one of the most revered saints of her faith. The city was Basra, in the lands of what is now southern Iraq, near the head of the Persian Gulf, a great city of the early Islamic world, and it was here, around the year 717, that the child who would become Rabia was born, into a poor family, the fourth of her parents' daughters. From this circumstance, the tradition relates, came her name, for Rabia means, in the language of her people, something like the fourth, marking her as the fourth daughter of her family. She was born, then, into poverty, the fourth daughter of a poor household, with little of the world's wealth or advantage. The traditions relate various beautiful stories of her birth and infancy, signs that marked her, even then, as one destined for greatness. But these are among the legends that gathered around her revered memory, and we will not dwell on them as established fact. What seems clear from the accounts is that she was born poor, into a family of humble circumstances, with no worldly advantage to ease her way, the fourth daughter of a poor household in the great city of Basra, and her early life was marked by sorrow and hardship, for while she was still young, her parents died, leaving her and her sisters orphaned. The loss of both parents, while she was still a child or a young girl, left her without the protection and support of her family, vulnerable in a hard world. And her hardships deepened, for a famine came upon Basra, a time of want and suffering in which the orphaned sisters were scattered, separated from one another, each left to face the hard world alone. The young Rabia, orphaned, and now separated from her sisters by the famine, was left alone and vulnerable, with no family to protect her. It was in these circumstances of vulnerability that the great misfortune of her early life befell her, for she was seized and sold into slavery. The accounts relate that she was taken by one who sold her into bondage, so that the orphaned girl, already deprived of her family, was now deprived of her freedom as well, made a slave, sold into the service of a master. It was a cruel fate, the enslavement of the orphaned and vulnerable girl, and it marked the lowest point of her early life, the depth of hardship and deprivation from which she would later rise. As a slave, she was put to hard labor, made to serve her master, to perform the difficult tasks of a bondservant. We will not dwell on the hardships of her servitude, for the simple fact of it is sorrowful enough. The orphaned girl, sold into slavery, made to labor hard in the service of a master, deprived of her freedom and her family, at the lowest point of a hard and sorrowful early life. It was from this depth, this condition of slavery and hardship, that she would rise, through her devotion, to the heights of spiritual greatness for which she is remembered. For even in her slavery, the tradition relates, Rabia was devoted to God, turning to prayer and devotion even amid the hardships of her servitude. By day she labored in the service of her master. By night, when her labors were done, she turned to prayer, spending the hours of darkness in devotion to God, drawing near to the divine, even in the midst of her bondage. Her devotion was not diminished by her hardship, but seemed rather to deepen through it, as she turned to God amid her sorrows, finding in devotion a refuge and a solace that her hard circumstances could not take from her. And it was this devotion, the tradition relates, that led to her freeing, in one of the most beloved of the stories told of her. It is said that one night, while Rabia was absorbed in prayer, her master overheard her, and beheld a wondrous sight. A light, by the accounts a lamp suspended without any chain, shining above her head, illuminating the whole room as she prayed. We tell this gently, as one of the beloved traditions about her, treasured by those who revered her, without insisting on its every detail. But the story relates that the master, beholding this wondrous light surrounding his praying slave, was filled with awe and fear, recognizing that she was no ordinary person but a soul of great holiness, near to God. And so, the tradition relates, the master freed her, releasing her from her slavery, unwilling to keep as a bondservant one so clearly favored by God, one whose holiness was so wondrously displayed. The light that surrounded her prayer revealed her holiness, and her holiness won her freedom, as the awestruck master released the saintly slave. It is a beautiful story, the freeing of the saint through the revelation of her holiness, and whatever its precise historical truth, it captures something the tradition holds dear. That Rabia's devotion was so great, her holiness so real, that it shone forth visibly, winning even her freedom from slavery. From the depth of her bondage, her devotion raised her, first to freedom, and then to the heights of spiritual greatness for which she is remembered. Freed from her slavery, Rabia did not turn to the pursuit of worldly comfort or advantage, as one who had known such hardship might have done. Instead, she gave the rest of her life to devotion, to the love and remembrance of God, choosing a life of simplicity and prayer over the comforts and pleasures of the world. The freedom she had won she devoted not to herself but to God, giving her liberated life wholly to the divine, to the deepening of her devotion, to the love of God that filled her heart. A deeply moving quality marks the arc of Rabia's life, the rise from the depths of slavery and hardship to the heights of spiritual greatness, and it is worth dwelling on, for it reveals much about the nature of the spiritual life and the power of devotion to transcend every worldly circumstance. Consider the depths from which she rose. She was born into poverty, the fourth daughter of a poor family, with no worldly advantage. She was orphaned young, losing the protection of her parents. She was caught in a famine, separated from her sisters, left alone and vulnerable. And she was seized and sold into slavery, made a bondservant, put to hard labor, deprived of her freedom as well as her family. She had fallen, through these successive misfortunes, to the very depths of worldly hardship and deprivation. A poor orphaned girl made a slave, with nothing of the world's advantage, at the lowest point of a hard and sorrowful life. And consider the heights to which she rose. From these depths of slavery and hardship, she rose to become one of the most revered saints of her faith, honored even by the great scholars of her age, the first and among the greatest of its women mystics, the teacher of the pure love of God, whose influence would endure across more than 12 centuries. From the depths of slavery she rose to the heights of spiritual greatness, from the lowest point of worldly hardship to a reverence that has endured across the ages. It is one of the most remarkable arcs in the spiritual history of her faith. This rise from slavery to sainthood, from the depths of hardship to the heights of holiness. What raised her from these depths to these heights was not any worldly advantage or fortune, for she had none, but her devotion, her love of God, the depth and the purity of her spiritual life. She rose not through wealth or power or position, which she never had, but through the depth of her devotion, the purity of her love of God, the reality of her holiness. It was her spiritual greatness, her devotion and her love, that raised her from the depths of slavery to the heights of reverence, that transcended every worldly disadvantage to win her a place among the most revered saints of her faith. Her rise was a spiritual rise, accomplished through devotion alone, transcending every worldly circumstance. A profound lesson lives in this, about the nature of true greatness and the power of the spiritual life to transcend worldly circumstance. For Rabia's greatness was not of the world, did not depend on worldly advantage, was not measured by wealth or power or position. It was a spiritual greatness, a greatness of devotion and holiness and love that transcended every worldly circumstance, that rose from the depths of slavery to a reverence enduring across the ages. Her life shows that true greatness, the greatness of the spirit, does not depend on worldly advantage, that it can rise from the humblest and hardest circumstances, that it is accessible even to the poor and the enslaved, for it depends not on the world's gifts but on the devotion of the heart. This is a deeply hopeful and encouraging truth, that the greatest things, the things of the spirit, do not depend on worldly advantage, are accessible even from the depths of hardship and deprivation. Rabia had none of the world's advantages, suffered the depths of its hardships, and yet rose to a spiritual greatness revered across the ages. Her life shows that the spiritual heights are accessible from the lowest worldly depths, that devotion and holiness do not require worldly advantage, that the poorest and most deprived can rise, through the devotion of the heart, to the greatest spiritual heights. It is a truth that offers hope to all, especially to those who have known hardship and deprivation, that the greatest things remain accessible to them, that the spiritual heights can be reached from the lowest worldly depths. And there is something fitting, even beautiful, in the fact that this teaching of pure love and this example of spiritual greatness should have come from one who rose from such depths. For Rabia's love of God was tested and proved in the fires of hardship, deepened through suffering, refined through deprivation. She did not love God from a position of comfort and ease, but from the depths of hardship, in slavery and poverty and sorrow. And her love, proved and deepened through these hardships, was the purer and the stronger for them. A love that had been tested in suffering and found faithful, that had risen from the depths and proved itself in the fires of hardship. The pure love that she taught was a love that she had proved in her own hard life, a love that had risen with her from the depths of slavery to the heights of holiness. So we may see in the arc of her life, the rise from slavery to sainthood, not merely a remarkable story but a profound testimony to the power of devotion to transcend every worldly circumstance, to the accessibility of the spiritual heights from the lowest worldly depths, to the way that love, proved in hardship, can rise to the greatest holiness. Rabia rose from the depths of slavery to the heights of spiritual greatness on the strength of her devotion alone, and her rise testifies to the power of the spiritual life, the love of God, to transcend every worldly disadvantage and to rise, from the humblest beginnings, to the greatest heights of holiness. She lived, the accounts relate, in or near the city of Basra, some traditions placing her in the city, others in the desert or wilderness outside it, living simply, devoted to her prayers and her remembrance of God. She embraced a life of asceticism, of simplicity and renunciation, holding the world and its goods lightly, content with little, free of the love of wealth and comfort that captures so many hearts. She wanted little of the world. The accounts relate, living in poverty and simplicity, her needs few, her heart given not to the things of the world but to God alone. At the center of Rabia's life, after her freeing, was prayer, the long hours of devotion she gave to God, the nights spent in communion with the divine, and this life of prayer deserves our attention, for it was the heart of her devotion, the practice through which her love of God was expressed and deepened. By the accounts, Rabia gave herself to prayer with extraordinary devotion, spending long hours, especially the hours of the night, in communion with God. While others slept, she would pray, giving the hours of darkness to her devotion, communing with the beloved through the long nights. The night was, for her as for many of the devout, a special time for prayer, when the world was still, the distractions of the day were stilled, and the soul could turn undisturbed to God. And Rabia gave the nights to prayer, spending the long dark hours in communion with the divine, her devotion deepening through these hours of nightly prayer. There are many traditions of the intensity of her nightly devotion, the long hours she gave to prayer, the way she would spend the night in communion with God. It is said that she would pray through the night until dawn, that she gave the hours of darkness to her devotion, that her nights were filled with prayer and communion with the divine. It is said that she would lament the coming of the dawn, for it ended the night's communion, the precious hours of undisturbed devotion, and called her back to the duties of the day. Whatever the precise truth of these traditions, they capture the intensity of her nightly devotion, the long hours of prayer through which she communed with the Beloved, the depth of the devotion that filled her nights. This life of prayer was the practice through which her love of God was expressed and deepened. For love seeks communion with the Beloved, longs to be in the Beloved's presence, to commune with the Beloved, to give attention and time to the Beloved. And Rabia's love of God expressed itself in this seeking of communion, this giving of her time and attention to God, this longing to be in the divine presence. Her long hours of prayer were the expression of her love, the seeking of communion with the Beloved, the giving of herself to God in the intimacy of prayer. And through this practice, this communion with the Beloved, her love deepened, growing closer, more intimate, more complete. A deeply intimate quality fills this picture of Rabia at prayer through the long nights, communing with the Beloved in the stillness of the darkness. For her prayer was not a mere performance of religious duty, but an intimate communion with the Beloved, a meeting of the soul with God in the stillness of the night. It was a love relationship, expressed in the intimacy of prayer, the soul communing with the divine Beloved, giving the precious hours of the night to this intimate communion. The long nights of prayer were the intimate meetings of the lover with the Beloved, the soul with God, in the stillness and the privacy of the darkness. Consider this practice of prayer as the expression and the deepening of love, for it speaks to the nature of devotion as a relationship of love. Prayer, in Rabia's understanding and practice, was not a transaction, a means of obtaining favors or avoiding punishments, but a communion of love, a meeting of the soul with the Beloved, an expression of the love that filled her heart. She prayed not to gain anything from God, but to be with God, to commune with the Beloved, to express and deepen her love. Her prayer was the practice of her love, the seeking of communion with the Beloved, and through it her love grew ever deeper, ever more intimate, ever more complete. A beauty lives in this understanding of prayer as the communion of love, the intimate meeting of the soul with the Beloved, that may speak to us whatever our own relationship to prayer and devotion, for it points to a relationship with the divine that is not a matter of transaction and exchange, but of love and communion, not a seeking of favors but a meeting of the soul with the Beloved. Rabia's prayer was the expression of such a relationship, the communion of love between the soul and God, and her example points to the possibility of such a relationship, a devotion that is not transaction but communion, not the seeking of favors but the meeting of love. The long nights of prayer through which Rabia communed with the Beloved express this understanding of devotion as the communion of love, and they remain, across the centuries, a beautiful image of the soul's intimate communion with the divine. So we should picture Rabia through the long nights, at prayer in the stillness of the darkness, communing with the Beloved who filled her heart, giving the precious hours to this intimate communion. It is an image of devotion at its most intimate and most pure, the soul communing with the Beloved in the stillness of the night, the lover meeting the Beloved in the intimacy of prayer, and it lies at the very center of her life of devotion, this practice of nightly prayer through which her love of God was expressed and deepened, the intimate communion of the soul with the divine that filled her nights and deepened her love across the long years of her devoted life. There are many stories told of her asceticism, her renunciation of worldly comfort, which we may treasure as expressions of the tradition's reverence for her, whatever their precise historical truth. It is said that she possessed almost nothing, that her dwelling was bare, that she was content with the simplest food and the humblest circumstances, wanting nothing of the world's luxury. It is said that she refused gifts that would have eased her poverty, unwilling to be distracted from her devotion by worldly goods, content with her simplicity, her heart fixed on God. These stories express the tradition's understanding of her asceticism, her renunciation of the world for the sake of her devotion, her holding of the world lightly so that her heart might be free for God. Among the most striking expressions of her renunciation was her refusal of marriage, for the accounts relate that she received offers of marriage, some from men of standing and learning, and that she refused them all, choosing to remain unmarried, devoted wholly to God. To remain unmarried was unusual in her society, where marriage was the normal expectation, and her refusal of it was a striking renunciation, a choice to give herself wholly to God rather than to the bonds and duties of marriage. By the accounts, she explained her refusals by her complete devotion to God, her heart so wholly given to the divine that there was no room in it for the love of a husband, her life so wholly devoted to God that there was no place in it for the duties of marriage. A famous tradition tells how she answered one who proposed marriage to her, which captures the spirit of her refusals. By the accounts, when a man of learning and standing proposed to her, she answered that her existence was wholly given to God, that her heart was so absorbed in the divine that she had no attention to spare for a husband, that she belonged so wholly to God that she could not give herself to any other. Whatever the precise words, the tradition relates that she refused marriage out of her complete devotion to God, her heart so wholly given to the divine that there was no room in it for any other love. Her celibacy was an expression of her total devotion, her giving of herself wholly to God, leaving no part of herself for the ordinary loves and bonds of the world. We should understand this renunciation, the asceticism and the celibacy, not as a grim rejection of life, but as the expression of a heart so filled with the love of God that it had no room for lesser loves and attachments. Rabia did not renounce the world out of hatred for it, nor remain unmarried out of coldness or fear, but because her heart was so wholly given to God that the world and its loves could not compete, could find no place in a heart already filled with the divine. Her renunciation was the overflow of her devotion, the natural expression of a love so complete that it left no room for lesser things. She held the world lightly not because she despised it, but because she loved God so wholly that the world simply fell away, unable to compete with the love that filled her heart. Let us consider more deeply Rabia's asceticism, her renunciation of the world, for it was a central feature of her life, and it is easily misunderstood, especially in our own age of comfort and abundance. For her renunciation was not a grim self-punishment, nor a hatred of the world, but the freeing of her heart for the love of God that filled it. We have noted that Rabia lived in great simplicity, wanting little of the world, holding its goods lightly, content with the humblest circumstances. She possessed almost nothing, by the accounts, her dwelling bare, her needs few, her life marked by a radical simplicity and renunciation. To our eyes, accustomed to comfort and abundance, this renunciation might seem a harsh and joyless thing, a grim deprivation. But this was not its spirit, for Rabia's renunciation was the expression of a heart so filled with the love of God that it had no room for, no need of, the comforts and goods of the world. The key to understanding her asceticism is to see it as the consequence of her love, not as an end in itself. She did not renounce the world for the sake of renunciation, nor punish herself for the sake of self-punishment. She renounced the world because her heart was so filled with the love of God that the world simply fell away, lost its appeal, became unimportant beside the beloved who filled her heart. Her renunciation was the natural overflow of her love, the falling away of the world from a heart so filled with God that it had no room for lesser things. The asceticism was the consequence of the love, the world falling away from a heart wholly given to the divine. A profound difference separates this love-driven renunciation and a grim, self-punishing asceticism. The grim ascetic renounces the world by force of will, struggling against desire, punishing the self, in a harsh effort of self-denial. Rabia's renunciation was not like this. It was the natural and even joyful falling away of the world from a heart so filled with love that it no longer desired the world's goods. She did not struggle against desire for the world, for her desire was wholly given to God. She did not punish herself in renouncing the world, for the world had simply lost its appeal beside the beloved who filled her heart. Her renunciation was effortless, in a sense, the natural consequence of a love that left no room for the world, not a grim struggle, but a joyful falling away. And her renunciation was, in this sense, not a deprivation, but a liberation, the freeing of her heart from the world for the love of God that filled it. For the heart attached to the world is, in a sense, captive to it, bound by its desires for worldly things, anxious in their pursuit and fearful of their loss. The heart freed from this attachment, by contrast, is liberated, free of the anxious pursuit and fearful guarding of worldly things, free to rest in the love of God. Rabia's renunciation freed her heart from the world, liberated her from its attachments, so that her heart was free for the love of God that filled it. Her asceticism was a liberation, the freeing of her heart from the world for the love of the divine. We can understand, then, why her renunciation brought her not misery but joy, not deprivation but fulfillment. For she had not lost something in renouncing the world. She had gained the freedom to love God wholly, the liberation of her heart for the divine love that filled it. And this love was her fulfillment, her joy, her complete satisfaction, so that her renunciation, far from depriving her, freed her for the love that was her deepest joy. She wanted nothing of the world because she had gained what was greater than all the world, the love of God that filled her heart and left her wanting nothing else. Her renunciation was the gateway to her fulfillment, the freeing of her heart for the love that was her deepest joy. There is wisdom in this for our own age, which is so captured by the love of the world, so attached to its comforts and goods, so anxious in their pursuit. Rabia's example points to a different way, the freeing of the heart from attachment to the world, not through grim self-punishment, but through the filling of the heart with a greater love. For the way to be free of the world's hold, her example suggests, is not merely to struggle against desire but to find a greater love that makes the world fall away, a love so filling that the world loses its appeal beside it. Rabia found this greater love in God, and it freed her heart from the world, made her renunciation a joyful liberation rather than a grim struggle. And her example points us toward the freeing of our own hearts, not merely through struggle against desire, but through the finding of a love greater than the world, that makes its hold fall away. So we may understand Rabia's asceticism rightly, not as a grim self-punishment, but as the joyful liberation of a heart so filled with the love of God that the world fell away. Her renunciation was the overflow of her love, the freeing of her heart for the divine, the joyful falling away of the world from a heart wholly given to God, and it brought her not misery but joy, not deprivation but the fulfillment of the love that filled her heart. Her asceticism was the gateway to her joy, the freeing of her heart for the love of God that was her deepest fulfillment, the liberation of a soul wholly given to the beloved. This is the key to understanding Rabia's whole life after her freeing, the life of devotion and renunciation that she embraced. It was the expression of a love of God so complete, so all-consuming, that it filled her heart entirely, leaving no room for the loves and attachments and pursuits of the world. She gave her freed life wholly to God, devoted herself entirely to the divine love that filled her, renounced all that would compete with or distract from this love. Her asceticism, her celibacy, her simplicity, her constant prayer and remembrance were all expressions of this one thing, the complete love of God that filled her heart and gave her whole life its meaning and direction. And in this complete devotion, this love of God that filled her wholly, Rabia found not deprivation but fulfillment, not emptiness but the deepest joy. For the heart that is filled with the love of God, the tradition holds, lacks nothing, wants nothing, needs nothing, needs nothing beyond the beloved who fills it. Rabia, her heart filled with the love of God, lacked nothing despite her poverty, wanted nothing despite her simplicity, needed nothing beyond the God who filled her heart. Her renunciation of the world was no deprivation, for she had gained what was greater than all the world, the love of God that filled her heart, and left her wanting nothing else. In her complete devotion she found complete fulfillment, in her love of God the deepest joy, in her renunciation of all else, the gaining of the one thing that mattered. At the very center of Rabia's life and teaching lay the doctrine for which she is most remembered, the doctrine of the pure and selfless love of God. And it is this teaching, more than anything else, that has made her revered across the centuries. For Rabia taught, and embodied in her life, a love of God so pure, so free of self-interest, that it sought no reward and feared no punishment, but loved God purely for God's own sake. Let us consider the community of the devout among whom Rabia lived, the early ascetics and pious figures of Basra, for she did not live in isolation, but among a community of those who sought the deeper spiritual life, and her place among them illuminates her significance. Basra, as we have noted, was an important center of the developing spiritual life of the faith, home to many of the early ascetics and devout, the figures who sought the deeper inward experience of the divine. These were souls who, amid the worldliness of the great commercial city, gave themselves to devotion, to renunciation of the world, to the deepening of the inner life. They formed a kind of community of the devout, a circle of those who sought the spiritual life, who shared a common devotion, who encouraged and instructed one another in the way of the Spirit. And Rabia lived among this community, a figure within the circle of the devout of Basra. Among the great figures of the early devotion of Basra was a renowned preacher and ascetic, a figure of great fame and influence, who was among the most celebrated of the early ascetics, known for his powerful preaching, his deep piety, his emphasis on the fear of God and the renunciation of the world. He was a central figure of the early spiritual life of Basra, revered as one of the great early ascetics, his teaching influential in the developing spiritual tradition. The traditions sometimes associate Rabia with this great figure, relating encounters between them, though the historical relationship is uncertain, for the dates do not always align, and such associations may be among the traditions that linked the revered figures of the early devotion. Whatever the precise historical relationship, the association of Rabia with the great figures of the early devotion of Basra reflects her place among them, her standing as one of the revered figures of the early spiritual life of the city. She was not an isolated figure but one of the community of the devout, honored among them, associated with the great figures of the early devotion, a part of the developing spiritual tradition that flourished in Basra. Her significance was recognized within this community, her holiness honored among the devout, her place secured among the revered figures of the early spiritual life. And yet Rabia brought something distinctive to this community of the devout, something that set her apart and marked her particular contribution. For while much of the early devotion of Basra emphasized the fear of God and the renunciation of the world, the sober devotion focused on judgment, Rabia emphasized the love of God, the pure and warm love that sought the beloved for the beloved's own sake. She brought to the community of the devout the distinctive emphasis on love, the warm devotion that complemented and transcended the sober devotion of fear, the pure love of God that would become her great contribution to the spiritual tradition. In this, Rabia stood out among the early devout, distinctive in her emphasis on love, marking a development in the spiritual tradition. Where others emphasized fear, she emphasized love. Where others focused on judgment, she focused on the beloved. Where others renounced the world in sober devotion, she renounced it in the overflow of a love that filled her heart. Her distinctive emphasis on love marked her particular contribution to the developing tradition. The developing tradition, the development from the devotion of fear toward the devotion of love, the introduction of the theme of divine love that would become central to the later flowering of the spiritual tradition. So we may see Rabia within her community, the circle of the devout of Basra, among whom she lived and was honored, and yet also distinctive within it, marking with her emphasis on love a development in the spiritual tradition. She was one of the community of the devout, honored among them, associated with their great figures, a part of the spiritual life of Basra, and she was also distinctive within it, bringing the emphasis on love that would become her great contribution, marking the development from the devotion of fear toward the devotion of love. Her place among the devout of Basra was both as one of them, honored within the community, and as a distinctive figure, marking with her emphasis on love a profound development in the spiritual tradition of her faith. To understand the radical purity of this teaching, we must understand the ordinary way in which devotion was often understood, and which Rabia transcended. For many of the devout, the worship of God was bound up with the hope of reward and the fear of punishment, with the desire to attain the rewards of paradise and to escape the fires of punishment. This was not wrong in itself, for the hope of reward and the fear of punishment are natural motives, and they can lead souls toward God. But Rabia taught a higher way, a love of God that transcended these motives, that loved God not for the reward of paradise nor out of fear of punishment, but purely for God's own sake, for the sake of the beloved alone. A famous saying attributed to her expresses this teaching with striking power, in which she speaks of her wish to burn away paradise and to quench the fires of punishment, so that God might be loved for God's own sake alone, and not for the hope of reward or the fear of punishment. By the accounts, she was seen carrying a torch and a vessel of water, and when asked what she meant to do with them, she answered that she wished to set fire to paradise and to pour water on the fires of punishment, so that these two veils might be removed, and people might love God purely, for God's own sake, and not for the hope of reward or the fear of punishment. Whatever the precise origin of this saying, it captures the heart of her teaching with unforgettable power. That the hope of paradise and the fear of punishment, though natural, are in a sense veils, distractions from the pure love of God, and that the highest love loves God for God's own sake alone, wanting neither reward nor escape from punishment, but only the beloved. This was a radical and profound teaching, the doctrine of the pure and selfless love of God, loving God for God's own sake alone. It transcended the ordinary motives of devotion, the hope of reward, and the fear of punishment, pointing to a higher love that sought nothing for itself, but only the beloved. It was, in a sense, the purest possible love, a love utterly free of self-interest, seeking no advantage, fearing no loss, wanting nothing but the beloved for the beloved's own sake. And Rabia not only taught this love but embodied it, living a life given wholly to the pure love of God, loving God with a purity that her teaching described. Let us return and dwell more deeply on the central teaching of Rabia's life, the doctrine of the pure and selfless love of God, for it is profound and worthy of deeper reflection, the heart of her significance and the source of her enduring influence. The essence of her teaching was that God should be loved purely, for God's own sake, and not for any reward or out of any fear. The ordinary devotion of many sought the rewards of paradise and feared the punishments of the next life, loving God, in a sense, for what God could give or spare. Rabia taught a higher love, a love that sought nothing for itself, neither the reward of paradise nor escape from punishment, but loved God purely for God's own sake, for the worthiness of the beloved to be loved. This was the essence of her teaching, the pure love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the beloved. A profound insight lives in this teaching, an insight into the nature of love itself. For the purest love in any context is the love that seeks not its own advantage, but only the beloved, that loves not for what it can gain, but for the beloved's own sake. A love that seeks reward, that loves for what it can gain, is in some measure a self-interested love, a love mixed with self-seeking. The purest love is free of this self-interest, seeks nothing for itself, loves the beloved purely for the beloved's own sake. And Rabia applied this insight to the love of God, teaching that the purest love of God seeks nothing for itself, neither reward nor escape from punishment, but loves God purely for God's own sake, for the worthiness of the beloved. This teaching had a radical implication, which Rabia expressed with striking force, that even the hope of paradise and the fear of punishment, natural and not wrong in themselves, are in a sense impurities in the love of God, elements of self-interest that the purest love transcends. For to love God for the reward of paradise is to love God, in part, for what one gains. To worship God out of fear of punishment is to serve God, in part, out of self-concern. The purest love transcends these self-interested motives, loving God neither for reward nor out of fear, but purely for God's own sake. This was the radical implication of her teaching, that the purest love of God leaves behind even the hope of paradise and the fear of punishment, seeking only the beloved. We should be careful to understand this teaching rightly, for it did not mean that paradise and punishment were unreal, or that the hope and fear of them were sinful. Rabia did not deny the reality of the next life, nor condemn those who hoped for reward and feared punishment. Her teaching was not a denial of these things, but a pointing beyond them, to a higher love that transcended them. She taught that there was a love higher than the love that sought reward or feared punishment, a pure love that sought only the beloved, and she called souls toward this higher love. It was not a condemnation of the lower motives, but a pointing toward the higher love, an invitation to rise from the love that seeks reward to the pure love that seeks only the beloved. And this pure love, Rabia taught and embodied, was its own fulfillment, its own reward, needing nothing beyond itself. For the heart that loves God purely, that seeks nothing for itself but only the beloved, finds in this love its whole fulfillment, its complete satisfaction, needing nothing beyond the beloved who fills it. The pure love of God is not a love that goes unrewarded, deprived of the satisfaction that the lower loves seek. It is a love that finds its whole fulfillment in the beloved, that needs no reward beyond the love itself, that is complete in its communion with the beloved. Rabia found in her pure love of God a complete fulfillment, a love that was its own reward, that needed nothing beyond the beloved who filled her heart. Something speaks to the deepest human longings in this teaching of pure love, this love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the beloved. For we long in our hearts to love truly and purely, to give ourselves to what we love without the calculations of self-interest, for the sake of the beloved alone. And yet our loves are so often tangled with self-interest, mixed with what we hope to gain or fear to lose, impure with self-seeking. Rabia's teaching of pure love points to the purest love, free of all self-interest, given wholly for the sake of the beloved, and it calls us toward this purity, this selflessness, this giving of ourselves to the beloved without thought of reward. It speaks to our longing to love truly and purely, and it points the way toward the purest love, the love that seeks only the beloved. This teaching of pure love is Rabia's great gift to the spiritual tradition of her faith and beyond, the doctrine of the selfless love of God that she set forth more clearly and embodied more fully than any before her. It became a central theme of the mysticism of her faith, treasured and developed by the generations of mystics who came after her, the ideal of pure love toward which they aspired. And it has reached beyond the bounds of her faith to touch hearts across traditions, for it expresses an ideal of pure and selfless love that speaks to the human heart wherever it longs to love truly. The doctrine of pure love is Rabia's enduring legacy, the gift of her life and teaching. the ideal of selfless love that she set forth and embodied, treasured across the centuries and across the traditions. Another famous saying is attributed to her that expresses this pure love, in which she speaks of two kinds of love, or two ways of loving God. By the accounts, she spoke of loving God in one way out of her own need and longing, and in another, higher way, for God's own sake, for the sake of the beloved's worthiness to be loved. In the first, she loved God for what God meant to her, for her own longing and need. In the second, the higher love, she loved God purely for God's own sake, for God's own worthiness, wanting nothing for herself. This distinction between the love that seeks something for oneself and the pure love that seeks only the beloved lay at the very center of her teaching, the call to rise from the love that seeks reward to the pure love that seeks only the beloved. Among the most beloved and enduring of the images associated with Rabia is the striking picture of her carrying a torch in one hand and a vessel of water in the other, an image that captures the heart of her teaching with unforgettable power, and it is worth dwelling on, for it has spoken to hearts across the centuries. The image comes from a famous tradition, which we should treasure as an expression of her teaching whatever its precise origin. By the accounts, Rabia was seen going through the streets of Basra carrying a lit torch in one hand and a vessel of water in the other. When she was asked what she meant to do with them, she answered that she wished to set fire to paradise with the torch and to quench the fires of punishment with the water, so that these two veils might be removed, and people might love God purely, for God's own sake, and not for the hope of the reward of paradise or the fear of the punishment of the fire. The image is striking and unforgettable, and it captures the heart of her teaching with vivid power. The torch to burn paradise, the water to quench the fires of punishment, these dramatic images express her radical teaching, that the hope of paradise and the fear of punishment are veils, obstacles to the pure love of God, and that if they could be removed, people might love God purely, for God's own sake alone. The image makes vivid and memorable the essence of her teaching, the call to a pure love of God that transcends the hope of reward and the fear of punishment, that seeks only the beloved. A boldness lives in this image, even a kind of holy audacity, in the picture of setting fire to paradise and quenching the fires of punishment. For paradise and punishment were sacred realities, central to the faith, and to speak of burning the one and quenching the other was a bold and striking thing, a dramatic expression of the radical purity of her teaching. The boldness of the image conveys the radicalness of her teaching, the height of the pure love she taught, which would leave behind even paradise and punishment in its pure devotion to the beloved. It is a holy audacity, this image of burning paradise and quenching the fire, expressing the radical purity of a love that seeks only the beloved, transcending even the greatest hopes and fears. The image has spoken to hearts across the centuries, treasured and pondered by those who have sought the pure love of God that it expresses, for it captures in a single vivid picture the essence of the purest love, the love that seeks nothing for itself, not even paradise, that fears nothing for itself, not even punishment, but loves the beloved purely for the beloved's own sake. It is among the most memorable images in the spiritual literature of her faith, an unforgettable expression of the pure love of God, and it has carried her teaching across the centuries in a form that lingers in the memory and speaks to the heart. Many other sayings are attributed to Rabia, expressing her pure love of God, her devotion, her spiritual insight, and these too have been treasured across the centuries. We should remember that the precise origin of much of this material is uncertain, that it comes through traditions gathered long after her time. But the body of sayings associated with her name expresses, with great beauty, the pure and selfless love of God that was the heart of her teaching, and through them, whatever their precise origin, the spirit of her teaching has been preserved. These sayings speak of the love of God that filled her heart, the longing for the beloved, the absorption in the divine, the pure devotion that sought only God. They speak of her communion with the Beloved, her longing for the divine presence, her love that left no room for anything else. They speak of her renunciation of the world for the sake of God, her holding of the world lightly, her heart given wholly to the divine. They express, in their various ways, the one great theme of her life and teaching, the pure and selfless love of God that filled her heart and gave her whole life its meaning. Through these sayings and images, the torch and water, the words of pure love, the expressions of her devotion, Rabia's teaching has reached across the centuries to touch hearts in every age. They have been recited and pondered, treasured and loved by those who have sought the pure love of God that she taught and embodied. They are her enduring voice, speaking across the centuries, calling souls toward the pure and selfless love of God, the love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the Beloved. And through them, the freed slave of Basra, the saint of divine love, continues to speak to hearts across the ages, her teaching of pure love preserved in the beautiful sayings and images that have carried it down the centuries. Many sayings and poems are attributed to Rabia, expressing this pure love of God, and they have been treasured across the centuries as among the most beautiful expressions of divine love ever spoken. We should note that the precise origin of much of this material is uncertain, that it comes to us through traditions gathered long after her time, and that not all of it can be confidently attributed to her. But the body of sayings and poems associated with her name expresses, with great beauty, the pure and selfless love of God that was the heart of her teaching, and through them, whatever their precise origin, the spirit of her teaching has been preserved and transmitted across the centuries. These sayings express a love of God of remarkable purity and intensity, a love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the Beloved, that is willing to forego even paradise for the sake of the pure love of God, that finds its whole fulfillment in the Beloved alone. They speak of the longing for God, the absorption in the divine, the love that fills the heart and leaves no room for anything else, the pure devotion that seeks only the Beloved. They are among the most beautiful expressions of divine love in the spiritual literature of her faith, and they have been treasured, recited, and pondered across the centuries by those who have sought to love God with the purity that Rabia taught and embodied. Something speaks beyond any particular faith in this teaching of pure and selfless love, this love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the Beloved. For the purest love, in any context, is the love that seeks not its own advantage but only the good of the Beloved, that loves not for what it can gain, but for the Beloved's own sake. Rabia's teaching of the pure love of God expresses, in its particular religious form, this universal ideal of selfless love, the love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the Beloved. And this is part of why her teaching has reached beyond the bounds of her own faith to touch hearts across traditions, for it expresses an ideal of pure and selfless love that speaks to the human heart wherever it longs to love truly and purely, without the calculations of self-interest, for the sake of the Beloved alone. In her own lifetime, the accounts relate, Rabia came to be greatly revered, honored as a saint and a teacher by the pious of her age, including some of the greatest scholars and devout figures of Basra. This reverence was itself remarkable, for in her society women were rarely accorded such honor in matters of religion and learning, and yet Rabia was honored even by the great male scholars and devout figures of her age, who recognized her holiness, sought her company, valued her wisdom, and revered her as a saint. By the accounts, the devout and the learned would come to her, seeking her wisdom, asking her questions, valuing her insights into the spiritual life. The traditions relate many encounters between Rabia and the pious figures of her age, in which she would offer wisdom, answer questions, sometimes gently correct or instruct even the great scholars who came to her. In these encounters, as the tradition relates them, Rabia appears as a figure of deep spiritual insight, whose wisdom was valued even by the learned, whose holiness was recognized even by the great, who was honored as a saint and a teacher despite the barriers that her society placed before women in such matters. The traditions preserve many beautiful stories of Rabia's encounters with the devout and learned figures of her age, encounters in which her spiritual wisdom shines forth, and these are worth dwelling on, for they reveal the quality of her insight and the depth of her devotion, whatever their precise historical truth. In these encounters, the great pious and learned figures of Basra would come to Rabia, seeking her wisdom, asking her questions about the spiritual life, valuing her insights, and Rabia, in the traditions, would respond with words of deep spiritual insight, often surprising or instructing the learned, revealing a wisdom that surpassed even theirs. The encounters reveal her as a figure of profound spiritual insight, whose wisdom was sought and valued by the devout and learned, whose words could instruct even the great scholars of her age. Many of these encounters turn on Rabia's characteristic emphasis, the pure love of God that transcended self-interested devotion. When the devout spoke of their fear of punishment or their hope of reward, Rabia would point them toward the higher love that sought neither, that loved God purely for God's own sake. When they spoke of their devotions and their spiritual efforts, she would point them toward the love that was the heart of all true devotion. Again and again, in these encounters, she pointed beyond the self-interested devotion of fear and hope toward the pure love of God that was her central teaching, instructing the devout in the higher way of selfless love. A famous kind of exchange, preserved in various forms, in which Rabia is asked about her spiritual state or her devotion, and answers in a way that reveals the depth of her absorption in God. When asked whether she loved God or hated the forces of evil, she would answer, by the accounts, that her love of God left no room in her heart for any other feeling, even the hatred of evil, so wholly was her heart filled with the love of God. When asked about her devotions, she would point to the love that was their heart and their meaning. These exchanges reveal the depth of her absorption in the love of God, the way it filled her heart so wholly that it left no room for anything else, even the feelings that ordinarily occupy the devout. The traditions also preserve encounters that reveal her humility, her freedom from spiritual pride, despite her great holiness. For one of the dangers of the spiritual life is pride, the subtle pride that can come from spiritual attainment. And Rabia, in the traditions, appears free of this danger, humble despite her greatness, attributing nothing to herself, seeking no honor or recognition. When honored or praised, she would deflect the praise, attributing all to God, seeking no glory for herself. Her humility matched her holiness, her freedom from spiritual pride, as remarkable as her spiritual attainment, so that her greatness was joined to a genuine humility that sought no honor for itself. We should treasure these encounters as expressions of the tradition's understanding of Rabia, its sense of her wisdom and her holiness and her humility, whatever their precise historical truth. For even if we cannot be certain of the historical accuracy of each story, they express the tradition's reverence for Rabia, its understanding of the quality of her insight, the depth of her devotion, the genuineness of her humility. Through these traditions, the tradition has preserved its memory of Rabia, its understanding of her spiritual greatness, transmitted across the centuries in the beautiful stories of her encounters with the devout and learned of her age. And there is wisdom in these traditions, whatever their precise origin, wisdom about the spiritual life that has instructed and inspired across the centuries. The emphasis on the pure love of God over self-interested devotion, the absorption in God that fills the heart and leaves no room for lesser things, the humility that seeks no honor for itself, these are genuine spiritual insights, expressed in the traditions of Rabia's encounters, that have instructed and inspired the devout across the ages. Through these stories, the spiritual wisdom associated with Rabia has been transmitted, the insights into the pure love of God, the absorption in the divine, the humility of the truly holy, that have guided and inspired those who have sought the spiritual life across the centuries. So we should value these traditions of Rabia's encounters, not merely as historical records, which they may or may not be, but as expressions of spiritual wisdom, as the tradition's understanding of her greatness, as vessels of the insights into the spiritual life that her example and teaching embodied. Through them, the wisdom of Rabia, the saint of divine love, has been preserved and transmitted, instructing and inspiring the devout across the centuries, carrying her insights into the pure love of God, the absorption in the divine, and the humility of the holy, down the ages to all who would learn from her example and her teaching. A deep significance marks this reverence accorded to Rabia, this honoring of a woman, a former slave, as a saint and teacher revered even by the great scholars of her age. In a society that accorded women few such honors, that placed many barriers before them in matters of religion and learning, Rabia was honored as a saint, her holiness recognized, her wisdom valued, her teaching revered. Her spiritual greatness transcended the barriers of her society, winning her a reverence rarely accorded to women, an honor that testified to the depth and the reality of her holiness. That she should be so revered in such a society is itself a sign of the extraordinary depth of her devotion and the reality of her spiritual greatness. There is an aspect of Rabia's story that deserves particular reflection, the remarkable fact that she, a woman and a former slave, came to be so revered in an age and a society in which women were rarely accorded such honor in matters of religion and learning. For this is among the most striking features of her story, and it speaks to the extraordinary depth of her holiness. In the society of her age, women generally occupied a subordinate place in matters of religion and learning, rarely accorded the honor and authority given to men. The great scholars, the revered teachers, the honored figures of religious life were, for the most part, men, and women were rarely accorded such standing. It was a society in which the religious and intellectual life was largely the domain of men, in which women rarely rose to positions of honor and authority in religious matters. This was the society in which Rabia lived, with its barriers and limitations placed before women in matters of religion and learning. And yet, in this society, Rabia rose to a position of remarkable honor, revered as a saint and a teacher, honored even by the great male scholars of her age. This was extraordinary. A woman, and a former slave, accorded a reverence rarely given to women, honored as a saint by the great scholars, sought out for her wisdom, revered for her holiness. Her spiritual greatness transcended the barriers that her society placed before women, winning her a reverence rarely accorded to her sex, a position of honor and authority in religious matters that few women of her age attained. That she should rise to such reverence in such a society testifies to the extraordinary depth and reality of her holiness, which transcended the barriers of her age. The traditions relate many encounters in which Rabia, the woman, instructed or gently corrected the great male scholars of her age, in which her wisdom surpassed theirs, in which she taught even the learned and the revered. In these encounters, as the tradition relates them, Rabia appears as a figure of spiritual authority, whose insight surpassed that of the great scholars, who could teach and correct even the learned, whose holiness commanded the reverence even of the great. The woman and former slave appears, in these traditions, as a spiritual teacher of the highest rank, whose wisdom and holiness transcended the barriers of her sex and her former station, winning her the reverence even of the great male scholars of her age. A deep significance lives in the way Rabia's spiritual greatness transcended the barriers of her society, winning a woman and former slave a reverence rarely accorded to her sex or her station. It testifies to a truth that the spiritual life affirms, that holiness and spiritual greatness are not the monopoly of any sex or station, that they are accessible to all, that the barriers of society do not finally bind the life of the spirit. Rabia's spiritual greatness transcended the barriers of her society, demonstrating that holiness is accessible to women as to men, to the lowly as to the great, that the life of the spirit is not bound by the divisions and barriers of society. Her example testified, in her own age, to the universal accessibility of the spiritual heights, the way that holiness transcends the barriers of sex and station. And Rabia became, through her greatness, the first in a long line of women revered in the spiritual tradition of her faith, opening the way for other women to be honored in the spiritual life. She is remembered as the first and among the greatest of the women mystics of her faith, the one whose greatness demonstrated that women could attain the highest spiritual heights, could be revered as saints and teachers, could hold a place of honor in the spiritual tradition. Through her example, the way was opened for other women to be honored in the spiritual life, for the spiritual tradition to recognize the greatness of women, for the barriers before women in religious matters to be, in some measure, transcended. Rabia stood at the head of a tradition of revered women mystics, the first and greatest of them, whose example opened the way for those who followed. Consider the significance of this for the recognition of the spiritual greatness of women, both in her own tradition and beyond. For Rabia's example stands as a testimony to the spiritual greatness of which women are capable, to the way that holiness transcends the barriers of sex, to the universal accessibility of the spiritual heights. In an age and a society that accorded women few such honors, she rose to a spiritual greatness revered across the centuries, demonstrating the capacity of women for the highest holiness, opening the way for the recognition of women's spiritual greatness. Her example remains a testimony to this, the freed slave who became one of the most revered saints of her faith, the woman whose holiness transcended every barrier, whose spiritual greatness has been honored across the centuries. So we should recognize in Rabia's story this remarkable dimension, the rise of a woman and former slave to a spiritual greatness revered in an age that accorded women few such honors. It testifies to the extraordinary depth of her holiness, which transcended the barriers of her society, and to the universal accessibility of the spiritual heights, which are not bound by the divisions of sex and station. The freed slave from Basra became the first and among the greatest of the women mystics of her faith, her spiritual greatness transcending every barrier, her holiness revered across the centuries, her example opening the way for the recognition of the spiritual greatness of women. As her long life drew toward its close, Rabia continued in her devotion, faithful to the end to the pure love of God that had filled her life. She lived, by the accounts, to a great age, growing old in her devotion, faithful through her long life to the love of God that had been its center. And at length, around the year 801, after a long life given wholly to the love of God, Rabia died, an old woman, in or near the city of Basra where she had lived. We will not invent the scene of her passing, nor adorn it with marvels, though the traditions relate beautiful stories of her death. It is enough to know that, after a long life given to the pure love of God, the saint of Basra came at last to the end of her devoted life, passing, the tradition holds, into the presence of the beloved she had loved so purely and so long. She was buried, by the accounts, in or near Basra, though traditions about her resting place vary, some pointing to other locations honored in her memory. We mention this gently and with respect, as the simple fact of how she has been remembered, for our story is of her life and her love, rather than of the honors paid after her death. It is enough to know that the saint who had risen from slavery to spiritual greatness came at last to her rest, her long life of devotion complete, her pure love of God faithful to the end. But though her life ended, her influence did not, but spread and grew across the centuries, far beyond anything her humble beginnings might have suggested. For Rabia became one of the most revered figures in the spiritual tradition of her faith, honored as the first and among the greatest of its women mystics, revered as the one who, more than any other, set forth the doctrine of the pure love of God. Her teaching of selfless love profoundly influenced the development of the spiritual tradition, becoming a central theme of the mysticism of her faith, treasured and developed by the generations of mystics who came after her. Her sayings and poems were preserved, recited, and pondered across the centuries, treasured as among the most beautiful expressions of divine love. And her example, the freed slave who became a saint of pure love, inspired countless souls across the generations to seek the pure and selfless love of God that she taught and embodied. We should pause to reflect on the relationship between legend and history in the story of Rabia, for it is a question that touches her whole story, and reflecting on it honestly deepens rather than diminishes our appreciation of her significance. The plain truth is that we know very little, with historical certainty, about the life of Rabia. The sources that tell her story in detail come largely from times well after her own, gathered and shaped by those who revered her, mingling whatever historical memory survived with the legends and beautiful stories that gathered around her revered name. Much of what is told of her, the wondrous light, the torch and water, the encounters and sayings, comes through these later traditions, and cannot be confidently established as historical fact. The historical Rabia is, in large part, hidden behind the beloved Rabia of the tradition, the saint of divine love whose story has been treasured across the centuries. This might seem to diminish her, to cast doubt on her story, to leave us uncertain of who she really was. And we should be honest about the uncertainty, not presenting legend as established fact, acknowledging that much of her story comes through later traditions of uncertain historical accuracy. But this uncertainty need not diminish her significance, for what is certain, what is beyond doubt, is the reality and the power of her influence, the way her example and teaching have shaped the spiritual life of her faith across the centuries. Whatever the precise facts of her life, the Rabia of the tradition, the saint of divine love, has been a real and powerful presence in the spiritual life of her faith, inspiring and instructing across the centuries. For the significance of Rabia lies not merely in the historical facts of her life, which are few and uncertain, but in the meaning and the influence of her example and teaching, which are real and powerful. The doctrine of pure love that is associated with her name, whatever its precise origin, has been a central theme of the mysticism of her faith. The example of selfless devotion that her story embodies, whatever its precise historical accuracy, has inspired the devout across the centuries. The beloved saint of divine love, the Rabia of the tradition, has been a real and powerful presence, shaping the spiritual life of her faith, whatever the precise facts of the historical Rabia. In a sense, the beloved Rabia of the tradition is, for the purposes of her influence and her meaning, the real Rabia, the one who has touched hearts and shaped the spiritual life of her faith across the centuries. The historical Rabia may be largely hidden, but the Rabia of the tradition, the saint of divine love, is vividly present in the beautiful stories and sayings that have carried her meaning across the ages, in the example and teaching that have inspired the devout. This is the Rabia who matters, for the purposes of her influence and her meaning, the beloved saint of the tradition, whose story, whatever its precise historical accuracy, has been a real and powerful presence in the spiritual life of her faith. Consider this relationship between the historical figure and the beloved figure of tradition, for it is common in the stories of revered figures, especially the saints and holy ones whose memory is treasured by those who revere them. The historical facts may be few and uncertain, hidden behind the legends and beautiful stories that gather around the revered name. But the beloved figure of tradition, shaped by the reverence of those who treasure the memory, becomes a real and powerful presence, carrying meaning and inspiration across the centuries. The beloved Rabia of the tradition is such a figure, shaped by the reverence of those who treasured her memory, carrying the meaning of her example and teaching across the ages, a real and powerful presence whatever the uncertainty of the historical facts. And so we tell her story as the tradition relates it, treasuring the beautiful accounts, the wondrous light, the torch and water, the encounters and sayings, while acknowledging their uncertain historical status. For it is the Rabia of the tradition, the beloved saint of divine love, whose story has touched hearts across the centuries, whose example and teaching have shaped the spiritual life of her faith. We need not resolve the uncertainties of history to appreciate her significance, for her significance lies in the meaning and the influence of her example and teaching, which are real and powerful, whatever the precise facts of her life. The beloved Rabia of the tradition, the saint who loved God without fear or reward, has been a real and powerful presence in the spiritual life of her faith. And it is this Rabia whose story we tell, and whose meaning we treasure. And so we hold her story gently, treasuring its beauty, while acknowledging its uncertainty, appreciating the beloved saint of the tradition whose meaning and influence are real and powerful, whatever the uncertainty of the historical facts. The historical Rabia may be largely hidden, but the beloved Rabia of the tradition, the saint of divine love, is vividly present, her example and teaching shaping the spiritual life of her faith across the centuries, her story touching hearts in every age. And it is this Rabia, the beloved saint of divine love, whose life we contemplate, whose meaning we treasure, whose example of pure love continues to inspire across the centuries. It is worth pausing, before we let her story rest, to consider the full sweep of Rabia's enduring legacy, for it is remarkable in its breadth and its endurance, flowing across more than 12 centuries from the life of a poor woman, a former slave, in 8th century Basra. Her influence reached, first and most deeply, into the spiritual tradition of her faith, the mystical tradition that sought the deepest experience of the divine. She is remembered as one of the founders of this tradition, the first great teacher of the pure love of God, the one who brought the theme of divine love into the developing spiritual tradition. The rich mysticism of divine love that would later flower in her faith traced much of its origin to Rabia, who stood near its source, the first to set forth the doctrine of pure and selfless love. Her influence on the spiritual tradition of her faith was profound and lasting, shaping its central theme of divine love for centuries. Her influence reached, too, into the broader spiritual literature of her faith, through the sayings and poems associated with her name, which became treasured expressions of divine love. These sayings and poems, whatever their precise origin, expressed the pure love of God with great beauty, and they were treasured, recited, and pondered across the centuries, becoming part of the spiritual literature of her faith. Through them, her teaching of pure love was preserved and transmitted, her voice carried across the centuries, her insights into the love of God made available to the generations who came after, and her influence reached, remarkably, beyond the bounds of her own faith, for her teaching of pure and selfless love has touched hearts across the religious traditions, recognized as expressing an ideal of love that speaks to the human heart wherever it longs to love truly. The ideal of pure love that she taught, the love that seeks nothing for itself but only the beloved, expresses a universal ideal that transcends the bounds of any particular faith, and it has touched hearts across the traditions, making Rabia a figure revered not only within her own faith but beyond it, wherever her teaching of pure love has been encountered. A remarkable quality marks the breadth and the endurance of this influence, flowing across more than 12 centuries from the life of a poor woman, a former slave, with no worldly advantage. Rabia had nothing of the world's power or position. She was a poor woman, a former slave, in a society that accorded women few honors. And yet, through the depth of her devotion and the purity of her love, she became one of the most revered figures of her faith's spiritual tradition, her influence enduring across more than 12 centuries, reaching even beyond her own faith. It shows the power of pure devotion, the the way a life of genuine holiness can transcend every worldly disadvantage to touch hearts across the centuries and across the traditions. And we come, at the last, to the deepest meaning of her life, the pure and selfless love of God that was its center and its enduring gift. Her life was, above all, a witness to this pure love, the love that seeks nothing for itself but only the beloved, that loves not for reward or out of fear but purely for the beloved's own sake. She embodied this pure love more fully than almost anyone, gave her whole life to it, rose from slavery to sainthood on the strength of it. And her life and teaching call us, across the centuries, toward this pure love, the selfless love that seeks only the beloved, the purest love of which the human heart is capable. This is the gift of her life, the witness to pure love that has reached across the centuries and across the traditions to touch hearts in every age. For we long in our hearts to love truly and purely, to give ourselves to what we love for its own sake, to be capable of a love that is not merely self-seeking. And Rabia's life and teaching show us such a love embodied, the pure and selfless love that seeks nothing for itself but only the beloved, and call us toward it. We need not share her particular faith to feel the beauty and the power of this pure love, to be drawn toward the ideal of selfless love that she embodied. Her witness to pure love is her gift to us across the centuries, the calling toward the purest love, the love that seeks nothing for itself but only the beloved, that has touched hearts across the ages and continues to call us, even now, even tonight, toward the purest and most selfless love of which the heart is capable. There is something remarkable in the breadth and the endurance of this influence, flowing across the centuries from the life of a poor woman, a former slave, in 8th century Basra. Rabia had no worldly advantage, no wealth or power or position. She was a poor woman, a former slave, in a society that accorded women few honors. And yet, through the depth of her devotion and the purity of her love, she became one of the most revered figures of her faith's spiritual tradition, her influence enduring across more than 12 centuries, her teaching of pure love treasured to this day. It shows the power of pure devotion, the way a life of genuine holiness can transcend every worldly disadvantage to touch hearts across the centuries. And here we begin to see the deepest meaning of her life, the thing that makes it endure beyond all the particulars of her story. Her life was, above all, a life of pure love, of the selfless love of God that sought nothing for itself but only the beloved. She loved God with a purity that has rarely been matched, free of the hope of reward and the fear of punishment, wanting nothing but the beloved for the beloved's own sake. And she gave her whole life to this pure love, rising from slavery to sainthood on the strength of it, embodying in her life the selfless love that she taught. Her life was a sustained witness to the pure and selfless love of God, the love that seeks nothing for itself but only the beloved. As we draw toward the close of her story, let us reflect on what Rabia's teaching of pure and selfless love might mean for us in our own very different age, for it speaks, perhaps, beyond the bounds of any particular faith, to the nature of love itself and the longings of the human heart. At the very center of Rabia's teaching was the ideal of pure and selfless love, the love that seeks nothing for itself but only the beloved, that loves not for reward or out of fear but purely for the beloved's own sake. This was her teaching about the love of God. But it expresses an ideal of love that reaches beyond any particular religious context, to the nature of the purest love in any relationship. For the purest love, in any context, is the love that seeks not its own advantage, but only the good of the beloved, that gives itself for the beloved's sake rather than for what it can gain. We live, in our own age, in a culture that often understands love in terms of what we gain from it, the satisfaction it brings us, the needs it meets, the happiness it provides. We are encouraged to seek love for what it gives us, to value relationships for what we get from them, to understand love in terms of our own satisfaction and fulfillment. And there is nothing wrong, in itself, with finding satisfaction and fulfillment in love. But Rabia's teaching points beyond this, to a purer love that seeks not its own satisfaction, but the good of the beloved, that gives itself for the beloved's sake rather than for what it can gain. It challenges our self-centered understanding of love, pointing toward a purer, more selfless love. Something speaks to the deepest human longings in this ideal of pure and selfless love. For beneath our self-centered seeking, we long, in our hearts, to love truly and purely, to give ourselves to what we love for its own sake, to be capable of a love that is not merely self-seeking. We sense that the purest love is the selfless love, the love that gives rather than takes, that seeks the good of the beloved rather than its own advantage. And Rabia's teaching of pure love speaks to this longing, this sense that the purest love is the selfless love, pointing toward the ideal of a love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the beloved. We might learn from Rabia's teaching then, even in our own age and even apart from her particular faith, something about the nature of pure love and the purification of our own loves. For our loves are so often mixed with self-interest, tangled with what we hope to gain or fear to lose, impure with self-seeking. Rabia's teaching of pure love points toward the purification of our loves, the freeing of them from self-interest, the giving of ourselves for the beloved's sake rather than for our own advantage. It calls us toward a purer love. In all our relationships, a love that seeks the good of the beloved rather than its own satisfaction, that gives rather than takes, that loves for the beloved's sake. This is not easy, for self-interest is deeply rooted in us, and our loves are not easily purified of it. Rabia's pure love was the fruit of a lifetime of devotion, a height of selfless love attained through years of spiritual labor. We should not imagine that we can easily attain such purity of love, that we can simply will ourselves to love selflessly. But we can aspire toward it, can seek to purify our loves, can strive to love a little more selflessly, a little less for our own advantage, and a little more for the beloved's sake. Rabia's teaching sets before us the ideal of pure love, and even if we cannot fully attain it, we can aspire toward it, can let it draw us toward a purer, more selfless love. There is, too, a particular relevance in Rabia's teaching for the religious or spiritual life, for those who seek to love God or the divine. For her teaching challenges the self-interested devotion that seeks reward and fears punishment, pointing toward a purer love of the divine that seeks nothing for itself, but only the beloved. Whatever our particular faith or spiritual path, her teaching challenges us to examine the purity of our devotion, to ask whether we seek the divine for what we can gain or purely for the sake of the divine itself, to aspire toward a purer, more selfless love of the divine. It is a challenge that reaches across the religious traditions, to all who seek the divine, calling them toward a purer love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the beloved. To contemplate this ideal of pure love, as the night deepens, is itself a kind of purification, a turning of the heart toward the purest love, away from the self-seeking that taints our loves. There is a beauty in the ideal of selfless love, the love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the beloved, that may move and inspire us, drawing us toward a purer love in our own lives. Rabia embodied this pure love more fully than almost anyone, and her example and teaching call us toward it, the pure and selfless love that seeks only the beloved. And there is something steadying, something elevating, in contemplating this pure love as the night deepens, a turning of the heart toward the highest and purest love, the love that gives itself wholly for the sake of the beloved. Let us try for a moment to picture the texture of Rabia's devoted life, the lived reality of her days and years given to the love of God. For behind the teaching and the legend lay a person, living a life of devotion, and it helps us to see her more truly. Her days, we may imagine, were ordered around her devotion, her prayer, her remembrance of God. There would have been the times of prayer, the foundation of her devout life, and beyond them the long hours of additional devotion, especially the nights given to prayer and communion with the Beloved. There would have been her simple life, the humble circumstances in which she lived, the few needs she had, the simplicity that freed her for her devotion. And there would have been, woven through it all, the constant love of God that filled her heart, the absorption in the divine that gave her whole life its meaning and direction. Hers was a life ordered wholly around the love of God, filled with prayer and remembrance and devotion, simple in its outward circumstances, rich in its inner communion with the Beloved. It was a life of great simplicity, as we have seen, free of the comforts and goods of the world, content with little, focused on devotion. She lived humbly, by the accounts, in simple circumstances, wanting little of the world, her needs few, her life stripped of all that would distract from her devotion. There was an austerity to her outward life, a radical simplicity, but it was joined to a richness of inner life, a fullness of communion with the Beloved, that made her simple outward life rich beyond measure within. The austerity of her outward circumstances was the frame for the richness of her inner devotion, the simplicity of her life the setting for the fullness of her love. And it was a life of solitude, in large measure, for she lived much of it alone, devoted to her solitary communion with God, apart from the bonds of marriage and family that filled most lives. She had chosen this solitude, this living alone with her devotion, refusing marriage, giving herself wholly to God rather than to the bonds of family. It was not a lonely solitude, the tradition holds, but a solitude filled with the presence of the Beloved, a being alone with God that was the opposite of loneliness, a solitary communion with the divine that filled her solitude with the presence of the Beloved. She was alone, but not lonely, for her solitude was filled with the love of God, her aloneness a being alone with the Beloved who filled her heart. Picture her, then, in her simple dwelling in or near the city of Basra, living her life of devotion, her days and nights given to prayer and the love of God, her outward life simple and austere, her inner life rich with the communion of love. We should picture her at prayer through the long nights, communing with the Beloved in the stillness of the darkness, her heart filled with the love of God. We should picture her in her solitude, alone but not lonely, her aloneness filled with the presence of the Beloved, her solitary life rich with the love that filled her heart. It is a picture of a life given wholly to love, simple in its outward circumstances, rich in its inner communion, a life ordered wholly around the love of God. As we contemplate this life given wholly to love, in the quiet of the night, we might reflect on the deepest meaning of Rabia's life, the pure love of God that was its center and its meaning. For her whole life, from her rise out of slavery to her death in old age, was given to this one thing, the pure and selfless love of God, the love that sought nothing for itself but only the Beloved. She loved God with a purity that has rarely been matched, and gave her whole life to this love, finding in it her complete fulfillment, her deepest joy, the meaning and the center of her existence. Something deeply beautiful and deeply peaceful lives in this contemplation of a life given wholly to love, a heart so filled with the love of God that it wanted nothing else, found in this love its complete fulfillment. For we long in our own hearts for such a love, such a fullness, such a complete devotion to what we love most, and Rabia's life shows us such a love embodied, a heart so filled with the love of the Beloved that it lacked nothing, wanted nothing, found in this love its whole fulfillment. To contemplate such a love as the night deepens is itself a kind of peace, a resting of the heart in the contemplation of the purest and most complete love, the love that fills the heart and leaves it wanting nothing. So as the night settles around you, and your thoughts grow still, You might let your heart rest in the contemplation of this pure love, this life given wholly to the love of God, this heart so filled with the beloved that it wanted nothing else. There is a deep peace in such contemplation, a quieting of the restless heart in the contemplation of the purest love. The woman who rose from slavery to sainthood, who loved God without fear or reward, who set forth the doctrine of pure and selfless love, has finished her long and devoted journey, has passed into the presence of the beloved she loved so purely. And her pure love remains, across the centuries, a beautiful light, calling us toward the purest love, the love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the beloved, even now, even tonight, as we turn toward rest. There is a lesson in this, or perhaps an inspiration, that reaches across the centuries to each of us who hears it, and beyond the bounds of any particular faith. It is the inspiration of pure and selfless love, the love that seeks nothing for itself but only the beloved, that loves not for reward or out of fear, but purely for the beloved's own sake. Rabia embodied this pure love more fully than almost anyone, and her life and teaching call us toward it, toward a love freed from the calculations of self-interest, given purely for the sake of the beloved. We need not share her particular faith to feel the beauty and the power of this pure love, the call to love truly and selflessly, for the sake of the beloved alone. There is a theme that runs through all the traditions of Rabia, beneath her teaching of pure love and her life of devotion, that deserves our reflection. The deep longing for God that filled her heart, the yearning for the beloved that was the wellspring of her whole devotion. For her love of God was not a cool and distant thing, but a deep and burning longing, a yearning for the beloved that filled her heart and drove her whole life. The traditions and the sayings associated with her speak again and again of this longing, this yearning for God, this deep desire for the beloved that filled her heart. She longed for God, the traditions relate, with a deep and constant yearning, desiring the divine presence, seeking the beloved, her heart filled with the longing for God. This longing was the emotional heart of her devotion, the deep yearning that drove her prayer and her renunciation, the burning desire for the beloved that gave her whole life its intensity and its direction. There is something deeply moving in this longing, this yearning of the heart for the divine beloved, that speaks to a deep dimension of the spiritual life. For the spiritual life, at its deepest, is not merely a matter of duty or discipline, but of longing, of the heart's deep yearning for God, the desire for the beloved that draws the soul toward the divine. Rabia's longing for God expresses this deep dimension of the spiritual life, the heart's yearning for the beloved, the longing that draws the soul toward God. Her devotion was driven by this longing, this deep yearning for the divine beloved that filled her heart and drew her toward God. We might reflect on this longing for God, this yearning of the heart for the divine, for it speaks to something deep in the human heart, a longing that many have felt, in various forms, across the ages. For there is in the human heart a longing for something beyond itself, a yearning for a fulfillment that the world cannot provide, a desire for a beloved beyond all earthly beloveds. Many have felt this longing, this yearning for something more, this desire for a fulfillment beyond the world. And the spiritual traditions have understood this longing as the heart's yearning for God, the desire for the divine beloved that is the deepest longing of the human heart. Rabia's longing for God expresses this deepest longing, the heart's yearning for the divine, the desire for the beloved beyond all earthly beloveds. And Rabia's life shows the fulfillment of this longing, the finding of the beloved for whom the heart yearns, the satisfaction of the deepest desire. For her longing for God was not a longing left unfulfilled, but a longing satisfied, a yearning that found its beloved, a desire that found its fulfillment. She found, in her love of God, the fulfillment of her deepest longing, the beloved for whom her heart yearned, the satisfaction of the desire that the world could not satisfy. Her life shows not only the longing for God but its fulfillment, the finding of the beloved, the satisfaction of the heart's deepest desire in the love of the divine. There is hope in this, for all who feel the longing for something beyond the world, the yearning for a fulfillment that the world cannot provide. For Rabia's life shows that this longing can be fulfilled, that the heart's deepest desire can be satisfied, that the beloved for whom the heart yearns can be found. She found, in her love of God, the fulfillment of her longing, the satisfaction of her deepest desire, and her life holds out the hope that this longing, in whatever form we feel it, can find its fulfillment, that the heart's deepest yearning can be satisfied in the love of the divine beloved. So we might see, beneath Rabia's teaching of pure love and her life of devotion, this deep longing for God, this yearning of the heart for the divine beloved. That was the wellspring of her whole devotion, and we might recognize in it something of our own heart's longing, the yearning for something beyond the world, the desire for a fulfillment that the world cannot provide. Rabia's longing for God, and its fulfillment in her love of the divine, speaks to this longing in our own hearts, and holds out the hope of its fulfillment, the finding of the beloved for whom the heart yearns, the satisfaction of the heart's deepest desire in the love of the divine. To contemplate this longing, and its fulfillment in Rabia's life, is to be reminded of our own heart's deepest yearning, and of the hope that it too might find its fulfillment, even now, even tonight, as we turn toward rest. Let us pause, before we let her story rest, to hold in our minds the central image of her life, the image that gathers up its meaning. A lone figure at prayer through the long nights, in a simple dwelling in or near the great city of Basra, her heart filled with the love of God, communing with the beloved in the stillness of the darkness, wanting God purely for God's own sake. There is in this image something that speaks to the deepest part of us, the recognition of a love so pure, so complete, so wholly given to the beloved, that it has touched hearts across the centuries. For we long in our hearts to love truly and purely, to give ourselves wholly to what we love, to be capable of a love free of self-interest. And in Rabia we see this pure love embodied, a love of God so complete, so free of self-seeking, that it sought no reward and feared no punishment, but only the beloved. She shows us what pure love can be, the heights to which it can rise, the completeness with which a heart can be given to the beloved. And she shows us, too, that such love is its own fulfillment, that the heart filled with pure love lacks nothing, wants nothing, finds in the beloved its whole and complete joy. She shows us, also, that this pure love is accessible from the humblest beginnings, that it does not require worldly advantage, that it can rise from the depths of hardship to the heights of holiness. Rabia rose from slavery to sainthood on the strength of her pure love, with no worldly advantage, from the lowest of circumstances. And her rise shows that the purest love, the highest holiness, is accessible to all, even from the depths of hardship, requiring not worldly advantage, but only the devotion of the heart. The freed slave, who became a saint of pure love, shows us that the spiritual heights are accessible from the lowest worldly depths, that pure love can rise from the humblest beginnings to the greatest holiness. So as the night deepens and your thoughts grow still, you might carry with you a little of her spirit, her pure love of God, her complete devotion, her heart so filled with the beloved that it wanted nothing else. Not as a burden, but as a gentle inspiration, a glimpse of the purest love, a calling toward the selfless love that seeks only the beloved. The woman who rose from slavery to sainthood, who loved God without fear or reward, who set forth the doctrine of pure and selfless love, has finished her long and devoted journey, has passed into the presence of the beloved she loved so purely and so long. And her pure love remains, across the centuries, a beautiful and gentle light, calling us toward the purest love, the love that seeks nothing for itself, but only the beloved. Even now, even tonight, as we turn toward rest. And here we return, at the last, to the quiet question her life poses to each of us who hears it. She loved with a purity beyond the ordinary, seeking nothing for herself, wanting neither reward nor escape from punishment, but only the beloved for the beloved's own sake. Her life asks us, gently, about the purity of our own loves, about whether we love for what we can gain or purely for the sake of the beloved, about whether we can rise, even a little, toward the pure and selfless love that she embodied. It is a searching question, and a beautiful one, and her life poses it with all the power of her pure and selfless devotion. There is no need to answer that question tonight. Some questions are not meant to be solved quickly, but to be carried gently, turned over slowly, lived with over a long while. Let it rest beside you now, softly, asking nothing of you but a moment's quiet reflection. The woman who rose from slavery to sainthood, who loved God without fear or reward, who set forth the doctrine of pure and selfless love, has finished her own long and devoted journey, and you have followed it gently all the way to its peaceful end. So let your thoughts grow still. Let the city of Basra fade into the dark, with its rivers and its scholars, and the freed slave who became a saint of pure love, praying through the long nights, her heart filled with the love of God. Let the names and the details drift away, for they have done their work. What remains is only the quiet, and the question, and the calm of the gathering night. May your mind grow easy, may your heart be untroubled, and may your rest, tonight, be deep and peaceful and kind.